basically what I'm saying is kids, be thankful that Mr. Dier here is your teacher.
I appreciate you saying that. So students, if you're listening, then you got to pay very close attention in class tomorrow.
Yeah, and don't get and don't use the language that we use, and don't be snitching on your teacher that he's coming on some commie podcast about history.
Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, 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 Dixieland.
All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in. Dixieland the Proletariat. We're going to talk about Southern working class history and current events from a leftist perspective. Make sure to like us on social media at Dixieland the Proletariat, or find all of our links at our Linktree, linktree/.prol, where if you want to give your wages to a bunch of rednecks, you'll find a link to our Patreon. We got some cool stuff to give you, including CD stickers, a cookbook, Discord server, and exclusive episodes. We also have a Spotify playlist with some great artists y'all should check out, as well as our merch store. This podcast is brought to you by a horrible job market, medical debt, living at home, aging parents, Kiaza pushing white men in the swamps, Nelson's love life, Tyler's testosterone levels, and Mark's laughter, which brings joy to the masses, and Joe Biden's top secret documents. You really had to fuck this one up, didn't you, Joe? Shout out to our new Patreon subscribers, Jessica and FP3. Our intro music is by Psychotic Refuge. Our producer is Mr. Speaker. Our monthly Patreon surplus goes to groups that are run by and or help marginalized people directly. As always, I don't know why I'm still here. I'm Nelson.
And I'm here in my feathers and beads, apparently.
And our guest this evening is the one, the only, the best friend of the show, the Italian stallion himself.
Come on now. I'll take it, actually.
The 2020 Louisiana.
It was a long time ago. Yeah. 2020. I got some award in 2020 for teaching. So, yeah. My name is Chris Dier. I'm so happy to be back, y'all.
Yay!
I actually got a mic this time. So if your listeners listen to the John Brown episode, I do apologize. And after that, Nelson was like, "You should probably get a mic." He said in the nicest way possible. Yeah. He said because people need to hear my voice, so I appreciate that.
Exactly.
And he sent me a link.
So much knowledge.
Yeah, he sent me a link to a mic, and now I have it. And people are, my night classes go better with this, so I appreciate you.
No problem, Paisan. I do want to say I need to get a sponsorship by that mic because Tyler has it, Kai has it, now you have it, and I've recommended it to other people. So I don't know who makes that. Some
Toner.
If you're listening to this, I want a sponsorship. I want percentage of sales. That's what I want.
Toner, sponsor this man.
Yeah, give me a sponsor.
Yeah.
Now, everyone, as you may know, our cheerful, lovable Mark is not with us tonight. Mark unfortunately got a hold of some cursed bones and has been summoned to the underworld to fight Cthulhu with said cursed bones.
No, we are not going into the H.P. Lovecraft racist shit.
Mark is fighting interdimensional demons with the bones.
No, Mark said specifically that they are a victim of capitalism right now. Or Mark can't be here.
It is past Mark's bedtime, and Mark had to go Betty bye. So Mark is tired and had to go to bed past their bedtime.
Mark is completely entitled to punch you this Friday.
Mark had
the other way
Mark
around.
Mark had like 2 monsters and still was tired. So that when Mark drinks that many, that's about a normal level of energy drink. So if Mark is having to go to sleep, and they've had 2 energy drinks, it's like they're like that's their warm up. And they're still tired, done. Someone's going to bed. So yeah, it's the 2 of us and Chris. It's I don't think we've ever done an episode just me and you.
This is the graduate school class.
This is the over 30 crowd. This is Adult Swim. This is Adult Swim.
Night school for adults who have jobs during the day.
Holy shit, this is night school.
Oh, that's so real.
Oh my god, this is night school. Professor Dier is here to teach us.
Oh Lord, I'll try. I don't think I will be doing much teaching. I don't know.
I mean, you're the author. You wrote the book, and I guess I tell people why we're here. We're here because for some reason people still listen to this podcast, and for some reason Chris doesn't think he's what am I trying? Chris, how do I word this? Chris hasn't figured out that he's too good for us yet.
Hold up. No, I resent that statement because y'all are one of the only podcasts that want to cover some of this history, by the way. So
yeah.
I will never feel too good for a podcast. Like, that's amazing. Like, you covered some amazing research that some things I've never heard before. So, like, what are you talking about? This podcast is amazing.
Now I'm gonna cry. It's that Italian charm. He's throwing it thick on me.
Yeah,
I'm gonna cry.
Yeah. You look good over there too.
It's that guinea charm. Shut up.
God.
I see the beard has grown out.
Whoa. I try. Thank you so much. Thank you. I got a new aftershave for my head, it's shiny and sparkle. But y'all, Chris is not just an accomplished teacher, but also an accomplished author, and sent me a signed copy of his book, The 1868 St. Bernard Parish Massacre, Blood in the Cane Fields. So, Chris, I'm just going to hand it over to you because you're the professional. You're the one that teaches the next generation of intellectuals. So I guess tell us about the book. Like, how does this is something that these massacres during Reconstruction are a lot of the times, as we all know, lost to history. So I had no idea that one actually happened right down the road from where I am in Eufaula, right after Reconstruction ended, I believe. That I want to do an episode on, but this is one that I hadn't heard before. So I guess why did you write this, and like tell us about it? And so I'm just gonna hand it over to you, and you do your thing.
Yeah, happily. Of course, if people, if they've seen the title, they know it's an incredibly sensitive topic. So viewer discretion is advised. I don't believe in sugarcoating history. A lot of my students, they know this, but my research covers an intense racialized massacre that occurred in St. Bernard Parish in 1868, hence the name. And for many people who don't know, St. Bernard Parish is mostly a working class suburb of New Orleans. So think of New Orleans and think downriver, south of New Orleans. Many people don't think there's anything south there, but there's a whole parish. And at least 35 Black Americans were murdered for simply trying to exercise their right to vote or for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it was a horrific event. And I sort of dedicated to myself to learning this history because, one, it's where I'm from. I was born in St. Bernard Parish. We're born in New Orleans, raised in St. Bernard Parish. And I still live in St. Bernard Parish. So I actually live where this massacre took place. And I was studying the history of the area. I am a school teacher, and I used to teach in St. Bernard Parish. I teach in New Orleans proper now. And so I was studying my students' history, and I came across this one little, it was like a little snippet, like a footnote in a book called Reconstruction in the Cane Fields. And it said that there were disturbances in St. Bernard Parish in 1868. And I was thinking, what in the world? I've never heard of anything like this. And I was asking people, I was, trying to figure out, what is this book referencing? And that's what led me down this rabbit hole and all of this research to try to unveil what happened. And as I'm doing this research and uncovering this massacre that happened in my hometown, I actually noticed that I am teaching some of the descendants of the victims and the perpetrators of this massacre in my classroom. Like I'm researching, I'm seeing the last names, and I see on my students' rosters the same last names. And I'm teaching at a middle school that was on the grounds of where the massacre took place. I mean, y'all, I could not, it was such a wild experience to research this massacre and then to know that I was teaching the descendants of both the victims and perpetrators, and they were in the same exact classroom. So if you want, I can give you like the full rundown from the foundation to St. Bernard Parish onward. I don't know how much time you have, but I'm happy.
We have as much time as you need to give us the background, what happened, everything.
Perfect.
Unless Kai wants to go to bed.
I'll just dip out later. You won't even know I've left. No, I'm here. I'm always here for
Yeah,
Chris's
let's
episodes.
go. Chris, you're like I said, you're one of the few people that not only now do you have a microphone we can hear you, but actually know what you're talking about. So please, we all want, Kai and I and our listeners, we love your episodes. So definitely, background, and then what led up to this, the massacre itself and the aftermath. If you could go into that, that'd be great.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
You
Because
got
it's still
all the time you
controversial.
need.
It's still a controversial
Okay.
topic, by the way. The Daughters of the Confederacy, they doxed
Friends of
me
the show.
along
Friends of the show.
How many times are we going to come across the Daughters of the Confederacy?
God, they're everywhere.
Oh, they go after y'all too?
No,
they
haven't.
I think my first two episodes concerned them, and they pop up, I would say, at least 3 or 4 times a year. So
Got it. Yeah. I'm on like their blacklist or something, and it's such a badge of honor, and a lot of it's because of this research. So
I want that's goals right there, education goals.
yeah. All right. Well, let's get into it. So it's an incredibly complex event, and it does require some historical context. St. Bernard Parish was incredibly diverse compared to many other places in the States. As early as 1800, they had Anglo-Americans, French Creoles, enslaved Africans, free people of color, Filipinos. St. Bernard Parish was home to the first Filipino settlement in the U.S. Pretty remarkable stuff. Acadians, we know them as Cajuns today, Haitians, Spaniards, and Isleños, which were islanders from the Canary Islands. And they all lived in close proximity. And as early as 1723, maps do show that there were plantations, indigo plantations, that existed in modern-day St. Bernard Parish. And of course, it operated on slave labor. So essentially, it was a slave society that was being built here, but also had other diversity in other ways. During antebellum, and as your listeners know, it's the period prior to the Civil War, the parish went from a society with slaves, with enslaved laborers, to essentially a slave-dependent society, and that was to meet the increasing demands of sugarcane. So right before the Civil War in St. Bernard Parish, and this is important for later, about 55% of the population was enslaved. So the majority of the population was enslaved, and the conditions were exceptionally brutal. In the book, I highlight some of the conditions, and these sugarcane plantations, I mean, of course, slavery in its totality was awful and brutal, but exceptionally brutal in sugarcane plantations in the heat in Louisiana. During the Civil War, we know that Louisiana joined the Confederacy, and as early as 1862, the Union regains control of St. Bernard Parish, and the slave economy, it crumbles. And the enslaved abandoned plantations in droves. I highlight all of these instances in the book. But essentially, the Civil War altered the social, political, and economic structure of the parish, and many poorer whites were also facing extreme impoverishment. So it's kind of a volatile time. And because these conditions were so dire, instead of blaming, what was going on the powers that be who created this system that failed, a lot of the powers that be, planters, former enslavers, political elites, they scapegoated freed people for these conditions. So the newspapers at this time were rife with racialized propaganda. I was poured into them, and it's just, they were awful. But essentially, they were stoking up people's fears and anger and trying to get people to place blame on freed people, on newly emancipated Black Americans. Obviously, we see, similar scapegoating today. I always tell my students, anytime people scapegoat minorities, like that's a clear sign. And we saw that back then, still see it today. After the Civil War, Louisiana enters Reconstruction. So St. Bernard Parish is under federal occupation. And it was during this time that there was new politics. There was new suffrage, which meant new politics. Freedmen gained the right to vote. We know the Reconstruction Amendments, the 15th Amendment, right to vote for Black men. And with this new suffrage came a lot of new legislation. So St. Bernard Parish helped vote in, because again, majority black. The Louisiana Constitution of 1868, which was Republican written and arguably one of the most progressive constitutions in the South, even attempted to end segregation. It should also be noted that when we say Republican, obviously it's a much different political party in the 1860s than today. If anyone's interested, I did do a lot of videos and research on that, but it was founded to stop the spread of slavery. That was its intended goal.
And I just want to say we did episode on the party switch. I don't want to say we have a previous episode on the party switch too.
Oh, well,
Donald Trump would not be arguing. The party of Trump is not the same as the party of Ulysses S. Grant.
Exactly. Yeah, it's night and day in so many different ways. But yeah, St. Bernard Parish was voting in all of this somewhat progressive stuff in the 1860s because of black male suffrage. They voted in a Republican governor, the youngest governor in Louisiana history, and they voted in Lieutenant Governor Oscar Dunn. And Oscar Dunn became the first black governor in U.S. history of Louisiana. So you should all do a podcast on Dunn if you haven't already. This guy was absolutely incredible. He was a formerly enslaved man who was the first democratically elected black governor in the U.S. I mean, he was also, many people believe he might have been poisoned, by the way, because he was rising so quickly. There's a fascinating graphic novel that just came out about Oscar Dunn called Monumental, written by one of his descendants, Brian Mitchell. He comes and speaks in my classroom. But yeah, if y'all ever looking for people to do a podcast on, this guy needs so much more recognition. So during Reconstruction, St. Bernard Parish was becoming a Republican stronghold due to black male suffrage. And it looked like the pattern was going to continue in the next presidential election of 1868. And of course, you could probably guess who did not want that to happen. A lot of racist white men did not want the parish to vote Republican in 1868. And you mentioned him, Ulysses S. Grant. He was running on the Republican ticket. On the Democratic ticket was a man named Horatio Seymour, who was a Democratic governor of New York. He claimed to be the, quote, white man's candidate, and he promised to end federal reconstruction of the South and somewhat return it to what he called home rule. And if you read Eric Foner or know any of his research on Reconstruction, he essentially calls home rule a euphemism for white supremacy. So Democrats and white people in the South, they had a lot to gain with the Seymour victory. If they could get Seymour into power at the federal level, then Reconstruction in the South would end and federal troops would be pulled from the South, and the South could revert back to essentially a system of slavery that it had before. So it was the controversy over the 1868 presidential election and the desire to silence the black vote that gave rise to this racist violence in St. Bernard Parish. Democrats were rallying. They were trying to, sway people to vote for them. And one Democratic rally, it turned deadly. The procession encountered a black man named Eugene Locke. And this guy is absolutely fascinating. Locke did something interesting. And the reason why I write about him so heavily, like I want him to be immortalized for what he did. The procession went up to him and they tried to get him to cheer for Horatio Seymour. He did not flee from the procession, and he didn't cheer. And usually people, if you see an angry, white mob coming through the streets armed, usually you get out the way. Eugene Locke did not get out the way. And because of that, this led to a scuffle and the crowd started to attack this man. Well, Locke was armed. And so when the crowd pulled out their guns to shoot him, he pulled out his gun and he fired back. And he hit people. So this guy all by himself, and this is all from testimonies, he stood his ground. And I think he had to have known, right, that he wasn't going to make it out. He ultimately died by a shotgun blast. But I mean, the idea of a formerly enslaved person who was armed with a pistol and refused to flee from an all-white procession and bold enough to shoot back, like that's pretty monumental. But it also enraged this angry white crowd. So right after that, they went on the killing spree to strike fear into the hearts of black people in the area. They went to nearby plantations and they started killing people in the most brutal, gruesome ways. Again, if you read the book, I go into a lot of detail about people that were killed and the ways in which it happened. It was nothing nice. They wanted people to feel pain. Sometimes they chose on purpose to use a knife instead of a gun. A white Union vet named Mike Curtis decided to get assistance. And he tries to go to New Orleans to get assistance. When the crowd finds out that he's trying to go to New Orleans to get assistance to protect freed people, they kill him as well. So he was the first white person to die, was someone that was trying to get help. So because of this, freed people, they gathered in defense and they armed themselves and they were ready to fight back. But some of the Republican leaders said it's not a good idea. Don't fight back. Like, let's everyone disperse and go about your separate ways. Let this all die down. So as freed people were dispersing the night after the first blood was spilled, they passed by a guy whose name is Pablo Falou, and it's an important name. I'll explain a little bit more of why that's the case. And they passed by this person, and there are so many different accounts to what happened when they passed by this guy's house. But two things were certain: shots were fired, multiple freed people were killed, and then freed people broke into his home, murdered him, and set his home ablaze. So as a result of this one night, the next day, two emergent narratives kind of popped up. White newspapers reported a shocking narrative. They said that, in fact, one newspaper specifically, the Louisiana Democrat, wrote an entire article that reported that Falou's wife and 3 children were burned alive. And word of this incident actually traveled around the country. The New York Herald reported on this and said that Black people were wreaking their demonic vengeance on the innocent and helpless. Direct quote, by the way. And saying that they're burning children alive. The U.S. government came down to investigate after the massacre, and the Freedmen's Bureau reported an entirely different narrative, that this guy, Falou, was shooting into a crowd, killed people, and the crowd retaliated. And Falou's wife and kids were not burned alive by any means. They escaped. I actually talked to one of Falou's descendants, and she said that Falou's wife and 6 children escaped. So I really went down the rabbit hole to figure out what happened in this catalyst. Nonetheless, Falou's murder served as this catalyst for an increase in the killings. White mobs ransacked plantations. They took registration papers. And if you take people's registration papers, obviously that meant people couldn't vote. So it was a political motive behind it. And due to this, freed people, they fled to the cane fields where they were pursued as well, which is why the title of the book is as is. The entire political establishment in Louisiana pretty much said they couldn't protect Black people in St. Bernard Parish. They told them, don't show up to the polls. Just keep hidden. We don't have enough troops to protect you, because this was happening all across the South, by the way. It wasn't just in St. Bernard Parish. There were other parishes in Louisiana that this happened in, and other parishes or other counties in the South. So federal troops were spread thin. Most of them were in New Orleans because things were going down in New Orleans as well. But yeah, I captured a lot of personal testimonies. One of them comes from a man named Lewis Wilson. And Wilson was kidnapped. He was brought to a makeshift prison. And at nightfall, he was sent to the street with other freedmen to be executed. I mean, a lot of these were execution-style killings. That's what makes this such a horrific massacre. Lewis Wilson, he actually survived. He was shot. He crawled away. And a man shot him again. And he crawled away. And he hid for 3 days. And he gave his testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau. As he's given his testimony, he still has the bullets lodged in him. Like, he still has bullets in him as he's given his testimony. And he could identify the person who shot him. So many of these people lived in close quarters with one another, and he could actually say, this is the person that shot at me. And in his testimony, he's asking to be taken to a hospital. So he asks for, medical assistance. And this is about a month after. So the book covers testimonies from Lewis Wilson and so many other people. And these testimonies, again, they're super crucial. They show that people can identify their attackers. They can, and it shows that many of them survived, again, with wounds and bullets that went untreated. The massacre lasted about a week, maybe a little longer. There was killings. And the final number of victims of this massacre, it ranges, by the way. I put it at 35 because that's the most conservative. We know at least 35 Black Americans were killed solely for trying to exercise their right to vote or for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the Louisiana General Assembly did their own report about a year later, and they put the death toll at 68. But they finished with this quote: "It is probable that many men were killed in the swamps, whose number is only known to the murderers and to God." It's a pretty bold quote. The U.S. Congress actually did an investigation, and they corroborated the 68 number. However, they revisited this later. The U.S. House of Reps starts revisiting these massacres in the 1870s, and they claim that over 135 people were killed. So if that's the number, if the U.S. House of Representatives is correct in their investigation, then this will go down as one of the worst massacres in U.S. history. This is almost to the level of Colfax, which we talked about before we started recording, which was a massacre in Louisiana that was deadlier than this one. We know at least 2 white men were murdered, Mike Curtis and Pablo Falou. Mike Curtis, again, was the guy trying to get help. Pablo Falou was the guy who opened fire, who was killed in retaliation. I did talk to some of his descendants, and they say that his son was murdered as well, but I have not found any documentation on that because a lot of these records were lost during Katrina and purposefully burned. If the federal government did not do an investigation on this and send the Freedmen Bureau agents to interview and do testimonies, we almost would have nothing local about this. It was one of those things where we are fortunate that the federal government came down and at least investigated. By investigated, they sent like a guy down to interview people and get a report and then go back. Like, he was only here for a day. He wasn't staying overnight. And you could probably see why. So the results were dire. Not were there only deaths, but also the political results were dire. Ulysses S. Grant only received 1 vote in St. Bernard Parish. And keep in mind, just a year or so earlier, St. Bernard Parish voted in a lot of these progressive measures, like the Constitution of 1868, which was trying to do away with segregation. And then with this election, only 1 person voted the Republican ticket. I would have loved to have a conversation with that one brave soul, like, who voted despite all of the chaos and the killing, and this guy still showed up. The entire federal government, after this investigation, they rendered the parish vote invalid anyway. Didn't even count it. Just threw it all out because the people who were supposed to oversee the election, many of them were killed, and many of them were killed or had to flee as well. Because of that, there was essentially no judge. And a guy by the name of Felipe Toca, he declared himself judge, and he arrested freed people. Over 64 freed people were arrested and charged with the killing of Pablo Falou. As you can guess, no one was arrested for killing African Americans, but over 64 people were charged with killing 1 man. And it's just one of these things where, again, this was not an atypical event. In the book, I quote a historian that says that although Ulysses S. Grant might have won throughout the nation, and that was due to the black vote, by the way, he says white terror carried the day in Louisiana. And this guy, this historian, his name is Dr. Rodrigue, he comes up with some numbers, and he cites that over 1,000 black people were killed in Louisiana just prior to the 1868 election. I mean, we talk about terrorism sometimes, and for some reason, you would think that when we talk about terrorism, like, this should be front and center. This was terrorism. And throughout an entire state, terrorism carried, as this historian said, carried the day. It was reverting so many local elections back to white supremacists, back to former enslavers. And the federal government did very little to stop it. Again, Reconstruction, it ends in 1877. After the Compromise of 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes signs a deal with Democrats in the South that if you give me the presidency, I'll remove troops from the South and you can just pretty much do what you want. It was like a carte blanche for white supremacists in the South to create their own governments and, really reinstate Jim Crow. So because Black political rights were limited during this time, many Black Southerners actually started to engage in the labor movement. And I know y'all know about this in Alabama, but there's a reason why there was an uptick in labor activism in Black communities, because many were so disadvantaged politically. This also happened in the 1880s in St. Bernard Parish. There's one strike that I was reading about where over 400 workers came together, Black and white, so much so like the federal government had to come down and put this strike down. And this happened all across the South. Because of this, a lot of states created new constitutions, and I believe Alabama created a new one as well around this time. And Louisiana,
they created 1901, and we still have it. It's still the Alabama. Yeah, Alabama has the longest constitution in the world, and we are still under the 1901 Constitution.
Wow. Yeah, in Louisiana, the Constitution, a new one came about in 1898. And what's happening is a lot of these southern states are reacting to the activism of labor unions or labor organizing. And they have to come with these new constitutions to further suppress Black Americans and further segregate. And so this new constitution disenfranchised voting by creating literacy tests. I show my students some of the literacy tests that were actually used in Louisiana. And I literally put it on the board, on the screen, and show them. And they're dumbfounded when they see it, because they're like, wow, there's literally no way you can pass a literacy test, right? And absolutely no way. And it was like that by design. But essentially, this new constitution issued poll taxes, required grandfather clauses, which meant that obviously if your grandfather could vote, you were automatically grandfathered in. Well, whose grandfathers were voting? Only, white Southerners. So obviously these laws, they weren't supposed to be passed, because you're not supposed to deny people the right to vote based on race. But all of these were, quote, race neutral, didn't mention race, but the way they were carried out was obviously in a racialized manner. And this solidified Jim Crow in St. Bernard Parish as well. And I think this is an important note that I teach my students, that in the 1860s, the United States saw more Black representation than for almost an entire century. So it shows that the progression of civil rights, or the regression of civil rights post-Reconstruction, proves that gaining rights isn't linear. And I always try to tell my students this, like, there are times when we have way more rights than other times. Reconstruction is a great example of that. That's why it's such an important piece of history. Black men had more rights and representation literally in the 1860s than in the 1950s. So after this new constitution was passed, the voting population declined significantly. The white male voting bloc went from 164,000 to 92,000, and the Black male voting bloc went from 130,000 to just 5,000. So in the early 1900s, only 5,000 Black Louisianians could vote. I mean, effectively silenced an entire demographic. By 1910, that number dropped to 730. And this is also during the time that Confederate memorials were skyrocketing, by the way. It was a triumphal time for white supremacists.
Hold on, time out. You said 138,000, right?
Yes.
To 700 something.
Yes, 130,000. I have the numbers here. That's how many Black men were on the voter rolls before this new constitution. Mm-hmm. By 1910, it was 730.
That's something that's definitely not taught in schools.
Absolutely not.
Unless you take your class.
I have a little chart too that I made for this that I show my students, so you can actually just see the huge decline as well. And they're shocked too. They're also shocked by the white vote block going down as well. They're confused about that too. But yeah, essentially the Black vote was silenced, effectively silenced. And actually, it wouldn't even be to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that these discriminatory voting practices would be outlawed. So it was like this all the way up until the late 60s. And even today, as we know, there are many attempts to try to suppress the vote. So to wrap up a little bit about this massacre, there was no book about it. It was barely mentioned anywhere. Most people have no idea this happened. No, most people in St. Bernard Parish don't know what has happened. And there's only one marker, only one relic that remains. And it's on the tombstone of Pablo Falú. And talk about some revisionist history. This man's tombstone, it reads, I still couldn't believe it when I found it. It reads, Pablo San Falú, assassinated by slaves, incited by carpetbag rule, died October 1869. I mean, this marker is so wrong on every single sentence.
Presented by the Daughters of the Confederacy.
I cannot find out who created this marker. I don't know, but I would not be surprised if it was them, and that's why they're coming after me so much. We could talk about that later, because there was a campaign to silence this history, and it worked in some ways too. I can happily get into that, but it has the word San in there, and if you know Spanish, San means saint. So they were literally deifying this person. They were calling him Pablo San, saint. They were giving him that title. They say that he was assassinated, which implies that he was a person of importance. He's not in any record before this, by the way, so he was not an important person. And they used the word slaves, which implies one of two conclusions. One, that those who were erected did not know that emancipation already occurred. Or two, they knew emancipation occurred, but refused to acknowledge it. And then the date is just wrong. I don't know how else to say that one. It says 1869. So it makes me think that it was well after. They were either, illiterate, or just it was erected well after. And you can still find this in St. Bernard Parish Cemetery, by the way. And there is someone that still brings flowers to that grave. And I've never caught them. I don't know. I would love to have a conversation. But that does still happen. As someone who's from St. Bernard Parish, who didn't know about this and who went down the rabbit hole for about 10 years now to try to figure out what happened, in 2018, what I did was I reached out to a church that was founded by a guy who survived the massacre. He escaped slavery, survived the massacre, and he fought in the Union, by the way, before he did all of that. And he started this church, First Baptist Church in Verret. You could still go there. It still exists. He started in 1871, and his great-grandson is the current pastor. And so I started going to this church and talking to people and hearing some oral history and oral testimonies. They called it by many different names. And by the way, this used to be called a riot. A lot of the reports call it a riot. When I wrote my book, I chose specifically the word massacre because it was a massacre. It wasn't a riot. A riot presumes spontaneity, or that, two sides were chaotically exchanging blows or something. That was not at all. This was calculated, strategically motivated, and it was done on purpose. It wasn't just some random act of violence. One of the descendants at the memorial service, she spoke, and she said that in her family's oral history, they called it the widow's maker. That's what they called it, because so many men were killed. And I have an exact quote from this lady. She says, if any of the men were found, they were dragged from the swamp and beaten to death, lynched, or shot. They were hunted down like animals, whether they were trying to vote or not. Families were killed and houses were burned down. So oral history says that there were many more deaths that we don't even know. And some of these people were given names that I've never seen in records before. So I think this massacre, I think it's safe to say, 35 is very inaccurate. I say that because of other reports and instances like this. So oral history is a really powerful tool when it comes to this. And this is probably massacres all across the United States. But essentially, my personal goal is to increase awareness. I incorporate this in history classes. I write articles. I'm working with Louisiana to try the state to try to erect a historical marker that can give a more accurate history. And trying everything I can to get that out there, because as we know, this isn't ancient history. The legacy of white supremacy is still with us. If we want to understand what's going on today, we got to understand what happened during Reconstruction. There's still voter suppression. There's still efforts by white supremacists to overturn elections. I mean, look at the January 6th Capitol riots. That's an ongoing legacy of something that this country has been doing for a long time. So everyone was so shocked in January 6th. And I just kept thinking about my research. I was like, no, this is what a lot of white people were doing for a very long time. It just is not as common as it used to be, but this is something that has happened. I mean, you can look at so many different, literally, counties in the South, and you'll find these type of instances, because at the end of the day, the system still exists, and it's our shoulders to, try to at least give some people some dignity or justice in history and do something about it today. And that brings me to a more interesting point, is that there are groups that try to silence this history. So I've been doxxed by many different groups that I've seen, like the Daughters of the Confederacy, or members of the Daughters of the Confederacy, and whatnot, where they rated my book on Amazon 1 star. Like, they all went on this one day, and it was like they just all tried to rate it 1 star. Amazon took them all down because it was kind of obvious that, hey, how can 100 people read the book on the exact same day and give 1 star? They called libraries where the book was, where I was going to read the book. They actually got one of the book readings canceled in the St. Bernard Parish Library. They just bombarded these old ladies and said that they were going to show up and protest me by the hundreds. And this lady did cancel a book reading, which people were going to. So there has been a coordinated effort by many people to try to get this history stifled. Not just mine, by the way, but by a lot of people. So essentially, that is probably the quickest I could give this story, this saga, any type of justice, because I could go on and on and on.
More.
There it is from this.
We want more. Give us more.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely.
I guess I do have a question. When your because I mean, and Kai probably has the same experience when Kai did a phenomenal episode that she did on the Residential School Network. What was, in your research for this book, what was the most shocking thing that you found? Something that blew you away? Like, I remember like researching stuff for podcasts we did, and then obviously with Kai's episode she's done. And for this book, I guess, like, what was the thing that kind of just like made you sit back and be like, holy shit?
I would say it's a great question. The thing that ignited me to do the research is still, in my mind, the most shocking. I'm from St. Bernard Parish. I grew up here. My mom's a history teacher. She still teaches history in St. Bernard Parish. I learned about the Battle of New Orleans, which happened in St. Bernard Parish. I learned about plantations. I learned about so much history that happened in St. Bernard Parish. And I had never heard of one of the largest massacres occurring in U.S. history in my own parish. And I was teaching in this parish, teaching history, and I never even knew anything regarding this. And I think that is the power of controlling history. If you can control history, then you control the present. If people don't look into this history, they're never gonna figure out the truth that happened in this country. And if you can create a country based on myths and fabrications, then it's much easier to maintain current systems. So I would say the most shocking thing is that this happened. I had no clue about it. And it wasn't just this parish as well. In Opelousas, Louisiana, that was a massacre that was arguably even deadlier. There's still no books written about it. I don't even think there's a Wikipedia page yet about that massacre. Like, these massacres are monumental in how they shaped our country. Again, you won't find the St. Bernard Parish Massacre or the Opelousas Massacre or the Bossier Massacre all in the same exact time in 1868 in Louisiana. You won't find any of that in any high school textbook.
There's a graphic going around. I've seen it a few times. I think I probably shared it on social media that pinpoints like the race riots, I guess, or the massacres really through Reconstruction throughout the South. And that's why I found out about the one you follow, because I had never, ever, ever heard about that before. But like, just there's so many, and obviously it's not even all of them, that it's just this history. Like in high school, even like the few like chapter or so on Reconstruction is just, it doesn't even scratch the surface of the horrors that were happening during Reconstruction and right after Reconstruction, and it's crazy.
And that graph map, I show my students that map. It's missing so much, by the way. Like the next slide are all the massacres that map is missing. So we don't even, that's the best map we have, and it doesn't even come close to covering what actually transpired. And I think it's also important to note, like as we talk about this history, that there was so much resistance that was going on that needs to be elevated as well. Like people were resisting, they were fighting back. They were still, exercising political and economic rights all throughout the South, despite this campaign of terrorism from the White League or the KKK and whatnot.
I will say, did you guys learn about the Colfax massacre in school? And we talked a little bit about that.
I learned about that in college.
Good Lord. I will say, and I highly recommend this book. I have anyway. It's this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. How guns how guns made the civil rights movement possible by Charles E. Cobb Jr. This goes it goes into the Colfax massacre, and it goes into a number of times, especially throughout the Deep South during Reconstruction and during Jim Crow, that freedmen and then black people like had guns, and they were like, we used them and we defended ourselves. And there's a number of, especially in historically black colleges throughout the Deep South, like Louisiana, like I said, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, like small historically black colleges in the sticks, right, surrounded by Klan. They would walk around campus with guns because racist the Klansmen and like the White League and whoever would come by and just start shooting randomly into the universities, and they were like, fuck this, we're going to defend ourselves. And there's a number of times throughout Southern history where black people have taken up arms and said, we're not taking it anymore. So this whole narrative that like that somehow this whole time period was peaceful is bullshit. But that like oppressed people did not fight back is completely wrong. And the whole idea of like this, it just being a nonviolent movement is not true. I am of the opinion that you can't, if your enemy is violent, you can't fight them with nonviolence. Like there are going to be some times where you're going to have to fight back. And it was a number of times in this book goes over, like if they did not have guns and they did not fight back, and they learned quickly that white people were cowards and scared half the time, that they would have just been completely massacred. But when they fought back, like white people were like, oh crap, we can't do this anymore, or we have to like tone it down for at least a decade or so. And they are just like, black people were just like, we're not going to fucking take it anymore. And I highly recommend this book to anyone who really wants to know about the kind of the Reconstruction and like before like the mainstream what we think of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, what I really like about that book is it complicates this narrative, this whitewash narrative about the civil rights movement, that everyone was just super peaceful and marching. Even that narrative is problematic and dishonest, because the civil rights movement, even the nonviolent aspect of it, it wasn't peaceful. It was super confrontational. Like it was going into the danger head first. Like that's not a peaceful thing to do. It was a strategy that was incredibly effective. Accompanying that strategy, what was actually violence, people who had guns, who were fighting back. And that's something that's not taught as well. Civil rights movement in schools and textbooks, it's highlighted or it's talked about in such a way that makes it palatable to white people. But there's a reason why legislation started moving a lot quicker when Malcolm X went down to Alabama, or when
that is a great story.
One civil rights leader, oh my God, it's slipping my mind. I can't remember who it was, but he essentially said in the 1960s, I'm abandoning this nonviolence. I'm picking up my gun. This is it, or something along those lines. And some leaders started saying things like that. And And all of a sudden, the uprisings in Detroit, in Chicago, in cities all in 1967 and 1968. Like, there's a reason why a legislation came, and it wasn't just because a few people marched in the South. And as amazing as the civil rights movement is, it shouldn't be minimized to the organizing that Dr. King and others did in the South, because it was much more massive, much more extensive, much more strategic, and much more versatile.
And King's house was an arsenal. I think there's a quote in the book where they were talking about somebody came to visit and they were going to go sit down in a chair. And I think King was like, "Oh, wait, don't, you're going to sit on the guns." And it was like literally King's house in Montgomery in the 50s, like an arsenal. That story of Malcolm X coming to Selma is hilarious. In it's funny because Malcolm X hadn't planned to, like, he wanted to come to Selma, but like King and like a bunch of people were like, "Oh, no, don't come to Selma." And so like he comes to Selma because King had been arrested and he was in the Dallas County jail. And Dallas County, the sheriff of Dallas County at that time was like notorious for making people, quote unquote, disappear. And everyone was afraid that King was going to get murdered by this sheriff and his posse and the Klan. So Malcolm comes down and he gives the speech at the one of the big churches in Selma and just like gets people just riled up. Like, people are like, "Yeah, this guy's awesome." I forgot which speech he gave, which one of his speeches he gave at the church, but when after Malcolm was done, King was like released the next day, and Malcolm is quoted as saying that, "I came down here." Someone asked him, like, "Why'd you come when blah 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 blah?" And he said, "I came down here to show these white people the alternative."
The alternative, exactly. Yeah.
And it just sends chills. Like, it's just beautiful.
Yeah,
I like to think what would have happened. What would have happened if Malcolm would have left New York and like moved his family to Selma? I sometimes think like what alternative history that would have done.
Yeah, it would have been a fascinating history. A lot more legislation would have been, rolling through. They're like,
because white people were scared shitless. Like, they were just like, "Oh fuck."
It's true. They really were. Fear motivated most white Americans throughout all of this. In the beginning, anyway.
Yeah.
So,
Kai, you want to bless us with knowledge?
I was kind of thinking, like, we kind of need to sit down, like, as a podcast and think about all of the topics that we could do almost by month, almost, of the late 1860s, because all of the, like, this is all happening in 1868. That's also the bane of my life. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, was signed that year. That just like skyrocketed kind of the Indian Wars through the northwest kind of area, not northwest United States, but kind of north Midwest. But like the late 1860s, just a maelstrom of political and civil action happening in this time period that just, it seems like every time we end up doing a show on here, it's like it's coming back to that year. It's coming back to this short time period when things are changing so much. But yeah, it was just
Kai, as you say that, I'm thinking about some of my students. I just finished this unit where I covered a lot of post-Civil War to 1900s, and I covered a lot in Reconstruction. And then the next day, I was doing westward colonization and Indian massacres and whatnot. And they were like, "Wait, this is like the same time period." And they were shocked. I was like, yeah, this is all. They were like, "Why don't we know about the 1860s and 1870s more if like all of this was happening during Reconstruction and everything out west was going on literally at the exact same time?" So
yeah, one of the first things that I remember before I was added to the cast of this show, one of the first things I remember is threatening Nelson and the crew fairly early on, because I would say good-naturedly people would share kind of in this leftism, looking at history kind of space, they would share memes about Ulysses S. Grant, who we talked about earlier. And Ulysses S. Grant did change a lot of things for Black people, for formerly enslaved people, but he was also an Indian killer, like a massive Indian killer. So you can't kind of uncritically look at any of these members, especially because what one system is getting in the South, another system is getting through the Midwest, another system is getting out further out west. this time period is just like, it's making my brain kind of explode.
Yeah.
Same with William Tecumseh Sherman.
Yeah.
So when I talk about his march to the sea and I show the quotes and everything, my students are like, "Oh, hell yeah, like he took it to those racists, blah 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 blah, and he tried to do, you know, the special order, the 40 acres and a mule." Like, my students start actually thinking positive about this guy, and I'm always like, wait, and I'm always like, before you think positive about anybody in history, wait, and then I have them
I wish
have them
listeners
read.
could see Nelson's face right now, because they did the exact same thing, and this is
Yeah.
what I did to them.
I will say, Kai is obviously Kai is will always. I will work harder, and Kai is always right. Okay, it's my favorite line from Animal Farm. But no, I did end up actually. I made a TikTok about this, and it kind of blew up because people were like, "Oh, but blah blah blah." I was like, I mean, no, like the thing is, like, I know the group that Kai is talking about is just like, you know, Sherman ended up becoming like some sort of like southern leftist folk here because of how he stuck it to the Confederacy and this march to the sea, which I wish was as brutal as like Lost Causes say it was. I wish that between 1861 and 1865, Sherman was the war criminal that like the South thought he was or says he was. But like the thing is like, and I brought up in the TikTok, like afterwards, like, you know, they all go out west. All these like these Union generals, the Grand Army of the Republic, moves out west and starts doing horrible massacres and like colonization. And the famous line from General Sheridan is, "The only good Indian's a dead Indian." And it's just, you know, you can't like
Tecumseh said something very similar too.
Yeah,
I felt like that was the Tecumseh quote. William Tecumseh Sherman quote.
I heard it was Sheridan.
Okay.
They probably all said
right.
it. They're all, you know, in their own way, racist shitbags. Like the only reason they just fought for, they just led like the quote unquote good guys during the Civil War. Like, you're not, we all know that they weren't like, yeah, everyone deserves equal rights and freedom and equality. It's just like,
no, it was their nationalism. They were like pro-US nationalism. They're like, wait, these people are turning their backs on this country. Like, that's what drove them. That's why Sherman hated the South so much, because he thought of them as just treasonous bastards in many ways. Like, he would say things like that. But yeah, continue. You're exactly right.
I know it's just like you can't venerate these people because sorry, Kai.
Just as a point, it's attributed to both of these people, Sheridan and Sherman, have said, if not that, something similar. And also, third one, if you want to throw this in, Teddy Roosevelt hit with that one in the early 1900s as well. I remember bringing that one up specifically. But Teddy Roosevelt was he was a bit flowerier with his language. I remember when I quoted it, it's a much longer quote what he said. But please do go ahead.
The duality of these people was crazy, because Teddy Roosevelt also was he hosted Chris Houdy hosts Booker T. Washington at the White House. He's like he
hosted Booker T. Washington. But also we know why so many white institutions were hosting Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, that Atlanta Compromise.
Yeah, they thought of him as like I respect Booker T. Washington and a lot of his work and whatnot.
Obviously,
but he was misinterpreted on purpose by white people as like, you see, this guy saying, pull yourself up from your bootstraps and everything will be fine. And white people in the early 1900s ate that shit up, including Teddy Roosevelt. So he did invite Booker T. Washington, but I don't think that says anything about Teddy Roosevelt as a person. I don't think he's open-minded, or at least, you know, tolerant in some way. He's just saying it's going along with the prominent philosophies and conservative theories at the time. So I don't give him any credit for inviting Booker T. Washington.
And I bow to Chris because Chris knows more than I do about this stuff. So what Chris says, I'll go with that, because we all know Teddy Roosevelt internationally was. Whoa.
I just taught him today, by the way.
That dude
how he helped orchestrate the Panama Revolt and stuff.
I did not like anyone outside of the U.S.
I want to kind of ask somebody who's in the trenches as a teacher, why is it when American schools are teaching history, especially American history, they shove kind of 1865 to 1900 all within like 3 or 4 days, and there's so much happening there, like without ascribing malice, because I want to. It's not on the teacher's part, it's on the curriculum part. But it feels like malice to be like, there's all these social movements happening. There's so much political roughage happening that like how can you shove all of that into such a small amount of time that you end up learning in school? And I will also say that I remember specifically, and this is saying, and this is somebody who went to a pretty liberal, very well funded school in Florida. I mean, it's Florida, but it's pretty liberal and pretty well funded. I remember Reconstruction taking like one day. Like one day. I remember like a paragraph in my history book.
Well, it's worse in Louisiana. It's switching next year, but in Louisiana, in middle school, they take U.S. History Part 1 in like 7th grade. That goes up to 1865. If you're on track, then you might be able to go into Reconstruction. But when I was teaching it, I taught for 5 years, 7th and 8th grade. I always tried to get to Reconstruction. I always did. And then when kids get into 11th grade in Louisiana, they start in 1877. They don't even talk in Louisiana. If you take a U.S. history class that's not AP or honors or anything like that, if you just take a regular U.S. history class, the curriculum literally starts at 1877. And you can't start it earlier or you could get in trouble. And again, if you do, you're essentially, I don't want to say, you're committing, I mean, it's illegal because in many ways, you have to follow the curriculum and your test scores are tied to funding and these tests are tied to your curriculum. So you're taking a huge gamble if you start doing things yourself. Fortunately, I teach at a very different school now. That is a unionized charter school. I teach mostly AP, and in my honors classes, I definitely wasn't following Louisiana's curriculum. So now that switch, now it goes back to the 1600s. And that's going to start next year because so many teachers fought. But I would say it's by design. It's on purpose. Imagine if millions of people in the United States, kids, learn about Black representation or massacres that happened against Black Southerners or Indigenous out West. I think that could shake the psyche of an entire nation when people actually confront that history. But we know who writes textbooks and we know who controls much of the Department of Education. It's not people who have a vested interest in telling accurate history. So if you break down the myths that the United States is founded on, these historical myths, I feel like that could shake so much to its core. I mean, imagine the majority of a generation, fighting for reparations or things of that nature. So I think it's by design. I think it's on purpose. And I am a PhD student who studies curriculum. And from what I see, I'm correct. Like I do feel like there were forces all throughout the 1900s, and not just the lost cause people of the South. There are people that were romanticized in the North as well. I'll never forget, I was walking in New York City one time, not to get too far off track. I was passing, it was right by the Plaza Hotel, and I saw this man on horseback, and I was like, wow, that looks like William Tecumseh Sherman. But I was very naive. This was like 10 years ago. I was like, well, surely they wouldn't put like someone who massacred Indigenous people but it was him. And so I was like, wow, like this whole country everywhere, not just the South, especially the South though, has these myths that kind of propped up our collective consciousness.
They didn't move that statue to Atlanta.
It would have a different meaning in Atlanta. Like I do feel like it probably
Kyle, I got a question. Did y'all learn about Rosewood in high school?
No. However, I will say that I am not the right person to ask about that because my dad was actually in a movie about Rosewood.
Oh, he was in the Rosewood movie? Was he in the actual movie Rosewood?
No, he was in a student film that came out years before that one. I think the one that he was in like 1994, 1995. So he was actually in a movie earlier. So I learned about that earlier. However, if you want to pick a different one, I didn't learn about the Ocoee Massacre, which happened 20 minutes from where I grew up. And one of the places that you have been looking at to live in is where it happened. I didn't learn about that one until that graphic that you guys are talking about came out. And then and the Ocoee Massacre happened just around the same time. I think it was 2 years different to the Rosewood Massacre.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know there was a movie about the Rosewood Massacre.
It came
it's
out,
a 1997 movie about Rosewood Massacre.
it's exactly what you think it is. It's like I haven't. Okay, to be fair,
is it like one of those made-for-TV movies?
No, it was actually in theaters. Like, to be fair,
Whoa.
I haven't seen it, but what I understand, it's like Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor. It's like, yeah, Pearl Harbor is happening in the background, but like I think I don't know if they got like what caused the massacre wrong, or like I will say it probably caused a lot of people to be like, oh shit, this actually happened, and then like it overall was a good thing. But it's a very Hollywood from like the 90s depiction of the massacre. It's not going to be like, like 100% historically accurate. It's very like Hollywood-esque from the 90s, what you think it is. But no, it actually is a movie. It has some big name people in it, I think. I haven't looked it
Learn
up.
something new every day. I'm gonna have to check it out.
Hold on, I'm gonna look up who all was in that movie real quick. Because like I remember the preview. Rosewood, 1997. It has an 87 on Rotten Tomatoes. Don Cheadle. That was it. Don Cheadle's a big one.
Wow.
John Voight is in it. Yep. The film is based on a true story. It came out February 21st, 1997. There's a lot of big. Okay. Oh wow. Yeah, there's a few people in it. But yeah, no, I mean it's there. You maybe you showed in class.
If my students listen to this, just saying, like, we got movies planned, so because they're gonna be like, even the guy on the podcast said we should watch this movie, and I'm gonna be like, we'll try, we'll try.
if I want to say this, if your students are listening to this podcast, students of Mr. Dier, if you're listening to this podcast, actually, you should thank whatever deity you believe in. If you don't believe in one, the stars or someone, that he is your teacher, because I wish I had a high school history teacher like Chris. All right. And y'all better not be falling asleep in his fucking class. I'm gonna come down there and stick my foot up your ass. All right. You're gonna have two Italians in there yelling and screaming at you with the hands. Minors. I will, because I had baseball coaches and substitute teachers for most of my history classes in middle school and high school. Like if I wasn't the hyper-focused neurodivergent when it comes to history and politics that I am, I want to learn shit. I had people in my class in high school that thought Pearl Harbor started World War I. Like it's ridiculous, and it really aggravates me, especially in election season, when people don't understand how the government works. But it's also very frustrating, like what Chris said about people like January 6th, and I joke that January 6th is like the liberal 9/11. But like there's so many people that don't understand that January 6th is nothing new for the United States. This happened constantly at the state level. It happened in Alabama. The election that caused the governor election that actually let the Democrats back into power and caused the 1901 Constitution that we still live under today in this great fucking state was stolen. The populist candidate that was the fusion between the black Republicans and white populists, the Democrats stole that election. They literally stuffed the ballots in the black belt, the planter class that got reparations, that came back into power throughout the black belt, literally stuffed ballots and intimidated people and turned people away from the polls and probably committed acts of violence in order to steal the election. It's one of those cases where, there's more votes that were cast than actually people that live in these counties. But, fuck it. So when people are like, January 6th, oh my God. And then when like Republicans today are like, oh, the election was stolen, which it wasn't, like, don't understand that like that did happen at the state level multiple times. And they even don't understand like how, what is it, the first 15 or so presidents were elected by process of cooping, like, roaming political gangs would beat the shit out of people and get them drunk and force them to vote for, America. I said this before and I'll say it again. The United States has never, ever, 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 ever in the history of this nation cared about democracy. They never have and they never will. and I'll say that if I ever teach one day, I'll say it in my class. I don't give a shit. The United States government, the United States people, the United States as a whole, the people, the population, especially white people, like probably white people in general, have never cared about democracy. This country was founded on undemocratic principles. It was expanded through undemocratic principles, and it continues today to be a shining example of an undemocratic society. So when people are like, "Oh, the United States is the greatest democracy," no, we're not even in the top 10. This shit sucks, and it blows my mind, and I really love watching people's heads turn when I say like, "Oh, but the Electoral College and gerrymandering and redistricting and this and this and this and this and the two-party system, people in other countries get to do this," and they're like, "What?" So yeah, it's bullshit. The entire system is bullshit, and this is coming
political
from
scientists. They don't even call it democracy anymore. Like when all the studies and stuff, they show it's clearly
we've literally we've backslid. It's like we're not even in the top. I looked at the Democratic Index. I've looked at it a few times, but it's like the dark green is supposed to be like the best. We're in like the light green. So like Western Europe and the Commonwealth, a lot of Commonwealth countries are better democracies than we are. And it's ridiculous. And I literally punch anyone in the face that says we're a democracy, we're a republic, and I just boom right in the face. And it's just like I hate people that say that. And that mentality, though, the people who say that are the same people that are okay with restricting what they see as a privilege to vote. And I found this in my studies about in my thesis about satisfaction in U.S. democracy, is that Republicans overall were polled and they see voting as a privilege and not a right. And it's always those people that are the ones that I found throw out the whole, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And it gets to the point where like that has become a dog whistle for we're okay with voter ID laws, and we're okay with gerrymandering, and we're okay with basically backsliding, and they'd probably be okay with literacy tests and poll taxes and Jim Crow era voter suppression tactics. And their ancestors are probably the same ones that had guns and went out there and killed black people trying to vote. So goes back, basically what I'm saying is kids, be thankful that Mr. Dier here is your teacher.
I appreciate you saying that. So students, if you're listening, then you got to pay very close attention in class tomorrow.
Yeah, and don't get and don't use the language that we use, and don't be snitching on your teacher that he's coming on some commie podcast about history.
Oh, they don't care about that.
Good, because if they do, something bad might happen to them. They don't understand. I got paid students. Okay, don't let his last name fool you. Chris is Paisan. Okay, bad things will happen to you. Okay, if you
know that much, they know about Italian,
and Kai is Italian adjacent, so Kai is our enforcer. Kai has removed people before.
Look, I don't know if we said that on a full episode. Okay?
Hey, I've heard stories
in the swamps. Kai, I do. Okay, in all seriousness, Kai, I do want to ask, because when Chris brought up the oral history, and I think people don't really realize, I know we all do, but don't really realize how important oral tradition, oral history is. And I know you brought it up during your episode on the residential schools, and even within your family, like how important that oral history is, how like things have been forgotten. And if it wasn't for this oral history, we would not know about this stuff. So if you wanted to add some stuff into like how oral history like is maybe like your take on it and how it means like to you as an indigenous person, like it seems like I didn't realize really until your episode how important oral history is.
Yeah, I think you could even tie it back into one of our other very good friends of the show, Donald Guillory, when he comes on and he talks about the importance of narrative, and that kind of dovetails into oral history, because the reason a lot of oppressed peoples end up having to rely, like we already have a tradition of oral history, but we end up having to rely on it because we can't trust mainstream recorders, mainstream historians to have taken our versions of the events in the first place, or be interested in them decades, hundreds of years afterwards. So we have to rely on them. Either that, or we learn the history through the oppressor's eyes in that way. And there's a lot of times since I've been doing this show, and a little bit before then, because before I was on this show, I was doing a little bit of education. I was asked to come in to Florida schools to do specifically programs about Florida Native Americans and westward expansion. I did a whole presentation on that. So I had a little bit of experience before then. So as I started to look into these things, I did even find the spots where, because I can trace back exactly when my family moved from community-based learning, tribal learning, into mainstream American learning, going through the American school system, starting for my family in the 30s. That's almost the point where you can see there's a break between the narratives that we heard from older stories versus narratives for newer stories, and who was telling which one. It's a difference of generation at that point, that my grandmother could tell a story in a slightly different point of view than my mother could, because my grandmother was, I think, the first generation on both sides of that side of the family that went to a specifically white school, a white Americanized school. Even her father before then went to a residential school in Canada, which is again another layer removed from oral traditions, probably the generation before him, maybe even a couple generations. It's because that's the Mohawk side. Mohawks tended to be more in on the ground with colonists, as opposed to my grandfather's side, which was Comanche. At that point, my grandfather would have been the first person, definitely, that went through any kind of mainstream American schooling. So that narrative and that narrative break that comes for, in my family, that break that comes in kind of the 1930s, that changes the viewpoint that my mom has. My mom specifically has a viewpoint that is more pro-American, even though I can sit and talk with her through how that doesn't make sense, through the things that we know from my grandparents and the people before that, that doesn't make sense. And she can look at it logically at that point and go, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Why am I think of it in this way? Because she went to a mainstream Americanized school system. So that narrative broke the oral tradition. And I was just lucky enough that my grandmother and grandfather were around for long enough for me to see that kind of that window into it, at least back to, so they would have been going to school in the late 30s and into the 40s. So at that point, I could trace it back to that point before it completely breaks from that. So to bring that into modern day, I remember specifically kind of when Standing Rock was going down. Standing Rock was going down in the fall and into the winter of 2016. Not that long ago. Everything is digitized. You could see the live feeds on several social media platforms. But I remember telling people, please watch the live feeds. Don't rely on the news, because the news is where it's going to start to change almost immediately. You could watch the narrative start to change because the people who are presenting the news have a vested interest in not sharing the same story that's actually happening on the ground. And you could see that happen constantly, that something that I could watch happen live. And this happened in Ferguson, happened in everything that happened kind of post 2016, 2014, really post 2014, all the way through with these social movements, is that you could watch it happen live, and in the same night there would be a news story that said something different. And at that point, you have to kind of start seeing these live records as the oral history of the time, that we have a record, a living record of what's happening, as opposed to what is being produced in media and eventually what's going to be produced in history books. And I mean, that's for basic history etiquette. You should be going for a primary source in the first place. So going to those points, rather than always, there's a lot of times where you have no choice but to rely on the news or books written somewhere around the time, but produced by somebody who wasn't actually there or wasn't part of the usually oppressed class that was in that kind of relying on the oral history. There's a lot of people that don't accept it. They don't see it as valuable enough because it's not written somewhere that can't corroborate it. And I can understand that, because you want to have the corroboration. It's kind of like, Chris, with your stats on how many people actually died. That's not a criticism of somebody who's trying to look back at something that happened 100-something years ago. That's just, you're going through an oral history, through a news center that probably is skewed against the people who this actually happened against. So relying on the oral history does feel like a flimsier kind of thing. You can't really pin it down. You can't study it in the same way like a science. But at the same time, you're getting a more colorful picture of what actually happened. You're getting the full sense, you're getting the full smell, the sensation of what's happening, because it's going through living people rather than a document. I don't know where my point is going to end up with this, but I know that I'm very passionate about it and I can't stop talking, so you got to come in.
I want to add on to that a bit. I loved everything that you were saying.
Yay!
I mean, yeah, oral history also humanizes the story and the experiences. I was, going through these reports from the Louisiana General Assembly, and what someone said, and I would read these numbers and whatnot. But when I actually spoke to a descendant who can tell me what she heard being passed down from a great grandfather, while she's on the porch listening, or so, like those experiences, that gives me chills. There's nothing that can replicate actually talking to someone who has that history. It's almost like, sacred in some way. I'm not even exaggerating. Sometimes I feel like I'm not worthy enough to hear such, deep family history. You can't replicate that in books or studies and whatnot. So yeah, oral history is super powerful.
Agreed. Yeah. Shit.
Changing the world one white man at a time.
At least we can do. No.
Yay! That's the whole basis of the podcast. Oh man. But I think that when we talk about history and it's when we talk about like horrific things that have happened throughout history, like it's sad that like I'm not trying to like oppression Olympics and say that anything that happened to any other marginalized people is worse than any other. But it goes to show that like we learn more about like the Holocaust, right, in school than we ever do about the actual pogroms and the massacres that happened in the United States. What blew my mind, Chris, when you were talking, is that this lasted for a week. I thought this was just like, a one-day thing, and that was a huge influx of violence one day, and then everyone scattered and we're like, what the fuck just happened? But the fact that this literal pogrom happened for an entire week, and that people were getting dragged out of swamps in the cane fields from hiding and being shot and lynched and God knows what else, is there's no words, right? You can't there's no way to there's no like feeling or emotion to describe this, so that it's just horrific. And the fact that like this happens, and we all grew up and live in southern states, right? And like we just all said, that there's countless massacres and countless historical events where people were brutally murdered because of the color of their skin or who they were, that we don't know about. Like I said, I'm in Alabama. I had no idea about the Eufaula massacre, which short little snippet is that basically in Eufaula, Alabama, black people went to go vote, and the white league showed up and turned about 1,000. Eufaula is a very small town. Turned 1,000 people away and killed upwards of 20 people. I think it was like somewhere between 10 and 20 people. The official numbers, they don't know how many were actually killed. And Eufaula fell to the Democratic Party. And Kai, we're talking about like Rosewood and I can't remember the other name that you said, the other massacre. Yeah, Ocoee massacre. And then Chris with St. Bernard massacre, Colfax massacre. Like, and then if you look at Georgia and Mississippi and Tennessee and Texas and Arkansas and South Carolina, North Carolina, like all throughout the South, and then all throughout the United States, like people don't know. Like the main example the biggest one that's probably come out is the Tulsa massacre, right? Nobody knew this happened until people were like, hey, there's mass graves. Like, we've been telling this oral history, like this happened, right? And people are finally now talking and learning about it 100 years after it happened, right? I don't think anyone knew about the Wilmington Race Massacre in North Carolina until January 6th happened. That was a big one that came up. But like, it's just, we learn more about horrible things that happen in other countries, but you never really hear about what happened here unless it's like a tidbit. Like in high school, you'll be like, oh, there's Western expansion and, you know, the Trail of Tears, and, you know, that was about it. But you don't know about the you don't know about Abraham Lincoln 1862 with the hanging of Kai. I'm so sorry. Who was it?
38 plus
Dakota.
Dakota
Yeah,
Warriors.
the Dakota. I did not know about that until like I went to Kai. I think you mentioned it. Kai was like one of the first people that said it. I was like, holy shit, that happened.
Every year there's a memorial ride. There's Dakota people that go
that
out for a memorial ride across the area. Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't really even when I went to Minnesota and like got to see like the monuments and stuff, I was like, holy shit. And then I went to then when I was there, like I saw other stuff that happened, like other massacres, other like literal concentration camps. And I was like, holy fuck. And it's just mind blowing that there are huge chunks of US history that we do not learn about. And people probably know more about stuff that happened overseas than they do our own country. And I think, Chris, you said, hit the nail on the head. Yeah. If more people knew about this, it would break down the mythology that is the United States, and people would really start to question, like, holy shit, what were we actually founded on?
Well, speaking of people knowing a lot about the Holocaust, Germany has done a much better job of teaching about the sins of their country than the United States. And what is the product of that? Now Germany has given billions in reparations because of the Holocaust and whatnot. So and now if you go to Berlin, I went this summer, there are Holocaust memorials everywhere. Like, it's in your face. They are reminding you because essentially they don't want this to happen again. Now, obviously, Germany's far from perfect. I'm not like holding them up as this, bastion of an example. But in comparison to the U.S., they do a much better job at trying to rectify their history than we do here. And you're absolutely right. Students know more about the Holocaust than they know about the genocidal atrocities in our own country. And students should know about the Holocaust. Don't get me wrong. Like, all students 100%. Should know about this massive,
especially now with somebody coming out and being like, oh, Hitler was good. Yeah. It's like, whoa, calm down there. Bro.
Right. Especially with this new rise of anti-Semitism. But they should also know about the pogroms that happened here. And they should know about everything here just as much as they knew about the atrocities elsewhere. The United States does a really good job of burying its history. And in some ways, almost literally. I'm sure y'all have heard of Oscarville, the black town in Georgia that was pretty much wiped away. No? Have you heard?
Every time you were on here, I'm going to have to start making lists, everything that you...
Is this the town that Lake Lanier's that was buried by
Lake
Lanier?
Yes. Yeah. Lake Lanier. So there are literally black towns that are now man-made lakes from like white people made lakes over former towns. Like,
that happened, right up Lake Martin, like under Lake Martin is I did a whole TikTok on it, I can't remember, but no, they flooded black towns in order to make Lake Martin, which is one of the largest man-made lakes in the world.
Yeah,
but
and where I am right now, literally 5 minutes away, I did a TikTok on this. There was Faisonville, which was a black town that existed from the 1860s all the way until 1960, and it was demolished. JFK signed off on it in order to make like a national park for the Battle of New Orleans. So, I mean, it's wild to live in a country where this happened so often in so many places, yet so many people have just zero idea. And it's intentional. It's certainly by design. But you're right, they don't know about the pogroms that happened here because there were many.
And when we do our episode on the Trail of Tears, I think we're going to probably get into a lot more, because people just think like, oh, it was a few hundred Cherokee, like we're kind of like, oh, go to Oklahoma. And no, that was a fucking death march from not much more than just a Cherokee.
I think the study I show my students...
Kai's going to make me cry. I know Kai's going to make me cry during the episode. That I no, if
Sometimes
anyone
we need that.
if people who are just tuning in and just haven't like if you go back and listen to that, right, like that residential schools episode, holy shit.
Yeah, for the record, the Trail of Tears episode has kind of been in the pipeline for over a year now. And the reason it keeps getting pushed back, there's some reasons that are outside of my control. But one of the reasons is that every time I do one of these episodes, it takes years off my life. It is very difficult history to go through and then condense and write a script for, and then think about like talking about it. In fact, when I did my presentations about westward expansion, it took me weeks to put together those presentations because it was just massacre after loss of land after women and children being killed out. Just it takes years off my life, so it is coming, but it's gonna take me a bit.
Yeah. I can't. It is when it's about people who look like you and sound like you and are you, right? It hits differently. I'm saying this. I know Kai, you're gonna go ahead and give me shit about it, but the one time I did feel instance like probably a tenth of what you felt when you did the residential school episode is when I read about and looked into the New Orleans massacre of the Italians. I was so mad. And I was like, holy shit, this is like what like Kai and other marginalized people feel like when we talk about or when they give presentations about like massacres that happened to their people. I was like shaking. I was so angry that like these fucking wasps, how dare they? And it's just like, and it's just like
it was boiled chicken and they're
bullshit. And it's but like I remember reading about it for the first time and I was like, these people have I was angry. I don't get angry, but I was angry. And I was just like, fuck that.
Well, a little point on that. There were a lot of lynchings of Sicilians in North Louisiana too, and one specific one.
Motherfucker.
Yeah, and I went to Sicily this summer, and they actually have a plaque that is dedicated to the victims of lynching in Louisiana, the Sicilians who were lynched in Louisiana. Like there's plaques in Sicily, like they memorialize it in Sicily. They don't even memorialize it here, and it's in schools. Like I went to one that was actually in a school that was memorializing the victims of lynchings, Sicilians who were lynched here in Louisiana. And I was just shocked. I was like, because I've never seen anything close to that in Louisiana. So to see another country, be more honest about our own history than us, which is not shocking. But also regarding the residential schools, Canada, apparently the government just agreed to pay $2.8 billion in restitution or reparations to indigenous communities because of obviously their genocidal tactics regarding these boarding schools. I think the U.S. will follow suit.
And we all know who got reparations for slavery: the plantation owners.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
I mean, it's always it's a seesaw because I think the biggest thing that's happened recently, I can't remember if it was in Canada or the United States. Again, I tried not to separate the two populations of indigenous people until it makes a difference which side of the border it happened on. But quite recently, I'm pretty sure this was Canada actually, now that I'm thinking of it, victims of a serial killer, their bodies were dumped into a landfill. There's at least 3 of them. They know exactly which landfill, and they will not try to look for the bodies. And one of the victims' daughters has had to come out and say, like, look, they are refusing to do anything to help us find these victims were women. Again, if you want any more information on that, go to the fall episode from a couple years ago where my sister and I talk about how shitty it is to be indigenous in the fall in North America, where we do talk a little bit about the missing and murdered indigenous women, children, and Two-Spirit people, specifically in Canada in this point. So a serial killer who is operating in Canada, I think, who targeted indigenous women, dumped their bodies in a landfill. the government is refusing to do anything about it to retrieve their bodies. So their daughters have created appeals, and they have vowed to go and dig through the landfill themselves to look for the bodies of these women, specifically one of their mothers, who was in there. So restitution and money versus literally not looking for the bodies of women who are worth less than trash to the government of Canada.
Justin Trudeau has been such a fucking disappointment.
Oh, I remember specifically before he was elected.
That French bastard.
Before he was elected, when the I Don't Know More movement was really kicking off, so this is the 2012 around there, there was a hunger protest done by the chief in El Sigpagtog, I think, the Attawapiskat First Nation. She went on a hunger strike, the chief, and Justin Trudeau, looking dreamy as hell in his fringed leather jacket and his eyes and everything, decided to come into this teepee that she was using as her ceremony space. Well, he didn't just like burst in there. He was invited in, but this is before he was elected, and he came in to talk to her, and there was this huge photo op of him talking to this woman, this chief who's on hunger strike. And I remember asking some Canadian friends of mine, like, who is this guy? And they're like, oh, he's the son of a former prime minister, and it's looking like he's probably going to get into politics himself, etc. And what I wanted to know is, who is this guy? Is he doing this as a photo op so that his political ambitions will take off in the future? And guess who was right? I was right about that.
Oh, he's the son of a famous politician. We don't know if it's another Trudeau. There's a little conspiracy there that he might be someone else's son. Viva la revolucion.
Nelson, don't sully this episode full of very good thought and history with your bullshit.
I want him to be Fidel Castro's son so badly.
It wouldn't fucking matter that this man has decided
I know.
to act like a fuckboy.
He's still a piece of shit. I
feel like that'd be worse if he was Castro's son.
I know, right? The apple fell way far from the tree. Yeah. What a fucking disappointment.
Wrap us up, Nelson. We've been on here almost 2 hours.
Yeah, but it's so much information. It's so cool. All right, Chris, probably the most important thing. Where can people find you that are not the Daughters of the Confederacy?
They already found me. So I'm on Twitter, just Chris Dier, Dier. You can email me, chrisdier3@gmail.com. I also like to keep it personal. So if you'd like a book, I'm happy to mail you a signed copy. If you just shoot me a nice little email. I have a website, chrisdier.com, where I post my write-ins or speaking engagements and whatnot. So yeah, Twitter, website, email, and TikTok. I'm on TikTok at Chris Dier. I forget about that sometimes, even though that's like the biggest one.
I didn't know if you were gonna keep that out because, like, I know you're on live. It's like, if there any students watching, you got to study for your test tomorrow.
Today I was teaching about U.S. imperialism, and I divided them up into different groups, and each group had a different place or country to research, Hawaii or Philippines and whatnot. And so I had them had my TikToks as like an option for them to watch. I mean, it's 3 minutes of condensed history. And so, I don't mind them watching TikToks. I just tell them if they pop up on my lives, they can't repeat anything I'm talking about if it's too wild or crazy or something. But my students are really cool. So they're usually very understanding. They're juniors and seniors in high school. So
they better stay cool. They're going to get a
Stop threatening minors, Nelson.
Hey, it's not a threat. Whoa, allegedly.
Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for coming back on. I'm going to do the outro, obviously, but at Dixieland, the proletariat believe the South will rise again, but this time for the right reasons. Those being work means production, decolonization, and self-determination for all oppressed peoples. Make sure to click on our link tree in the show notes to find all of our social media. We are coming to you from the birthplace of the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama, as well as sweet Georgia and jolly old England. We also have to recognize we're recording on land that is occupied and rightfully belongs to the Muskogee and Cherokee Nation. Chris, again, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you. We always learn so much with your episodes, and you're definitely an actual friend of the show. And in the future, we definitely want to have you on again. to educate us on another topic that definitely needs to be talked about. So thank you again so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for having me. Happy to join whenever you want.
And Mark's not here to send us off, but just I want everyone that if you see some roadkill on the side of the road, I want you to think of Mark, because Mark sends us picture of roadkill because they love bones.